Okay, bye. Alrighty, I think we need the music to ultimately be cut. Faye, can we cut the music? Well, welcome everyone. Hopefully you're enjoying some of the sounds of the elements, including the grainy noises. This is us making our grand entrance onto YouTube for sure, but we're trying to figure out our multiple Instagram pages. So thank you for your patience. Is anyone else hearing that like staticky feedback? Cute. Okay, let me.
Someone try muting. Maybe it's somebody's specific mic.
Oh, who was that? The last person who muted. You know, I think it could have been Faye. So let's give a shout out to Faye, who is running all of the tech on the back end. Thank you to her. And here we are. We made it.
Woohoo.
Good evening,
Hi,
everyone.
everybody.
Oh, I hear that. Angela, is it you?
Oh, my apologies. Is that
Can
better?
you try mute?
Yes.
Can you try muting?
Awesome.
That's
awesome.
better.
It was Angela the whole time. All right, take us away, Angela.
Okay, well, hi, Internet friends. Hi, happy Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I'm Angela Pedregal. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a proud civic engagement organizer with L.E.A.D Filipino, and I'll be moderating tonight's discussion on Callais v. Louisiana. So first of all, we want to thank L.E.A.D Filipino for convening us here tonight on this super important discussion with all of our panelists and attendees that are chiming in from all corners of the country. So we'll be hearing from our panelists later tonight, especially when it comes to voting rights, representations, political power when it comes to redrawing these maps, and most importantly, what can we do and how it will affect all of our communities across the board, across the political spectrum. We'll be discussing the legal and historical and community impacts, especially around this decision and how it'll impact this midterm election season and the forthcoming ones. So for all of our internet friends out there, please feel free to engage in the chat. We love all of the comments that you're sharing already online. This is a live show, so that's what makes it super exciting. We'll have time for Q&A, so please put it in the chat and we'll make sure we'll get to your question. And with that, I'd love to introduce our CEO of L.E.A.D Filipino, Dr. Angelica Cortez, to set the tone for the evening.
Wonderful. Thank you, Angela. And good evening, everyone. We are feverishly monitoring our Instagram pages. So that's L.E.A.D Filipino, L.E.A.D Filipino TX, and L.E.A.D Filipino LV. If you are watching on YouTube, I think you are nearly in the right place since we're having some issues with Instagram. If you are tuning in through YouTube, please, if the closed captioning is helpful for you, please turn that on. We did do some research with StreamYard a few minutes ago, and unfortunately, for some reason, they do not have that feature, so we apologize. But through Instagram and YouTube, you should be able to toggle on closed captions for your viewing pleasure. But again, good evening, everyone. I hope we get this Instagram issue figured out, but our team is working behind the scenes to get that underway. But on behalf of our organization and our partners on the line, I just want to express our gratitude. We're thankful to convene this conversation on the recent Callais versus Louisiana decision, as Angela said, in conversation around voting rights and specifically what this moment means for our communities and for multiracial democracy in this country. And I want to start by grounding us in why we felt that this was an important conversation for a Filipina EXO organization to help convene, because I think too often our communities engage in civic participation narrowly as something that begins and ends with voter registration. As my good friend Alina would say, the journey can't begin and end with simply being registered. It has to continue around our census activation, our demographic visibility. And by registered voters, we know that registered voters do not equate to engaged communities. And that's what we're seeing on the ground right now as we run our Get Out the Filipino Vote multi-city and multi-state campaign. And that visibility alone does not automatically translate into our power. So at the same time, we're living through a moment where we are actively witnessing fights over whose communities matter and whose political voices are protected and whose representation can be weakened, fractured, or ultimately disposed of. And we take issue with that. And while the direct impacts of racial gerrymandering and voter dilution have and continue to disproportionately target Black communities across the South, we believe the broader fight for civil and human rights is a fight that we all need to carry, because many of our communities, Filipinas, X's and O's, AAPIs, Latino, Latine, Latinx, immigrant and working families are ultimately connected across our shared futures. And so I think that with our size as one of the largest AAPI populations in the country, that comes with responsibility. So tonight is the beginning of, I think, multiple and ongoing conversations as we navigate this new political era. But again, thank you to our partners. We're especially honored tonight to be joined by speakers, legal experts, and advocates across the country that we have the privilege to do work with on a daily basis. So thank you again to all of you. And let's get this important dialogue going, Angela.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Cortez or Jill. So as you said, we all hear conversations around voting rights online and in person, and we hear that it feels distant and disconnected. So we're excited to explore how that relationship between community engagement and storytelling, and especially political participation when it comes to historic midterm elections and presidential elections within our communities across the board. So I'd love to invite each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Let's start off with Alina, followed by Kat Evasco.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Lead Filipino. Thank you, Angela, for this opportunity. My name is Alina Yin. I am the founder and CEO of Dreaming Collaborative, and we are a civic nonprofit working at the intersection of culture, technology, and civic life to reimagine the practice of democracy in local governments. And I'm really excited to be here.
Hey folks, thank you Lead Filipino for inviting us into this conversation. My name is Kat Evasco, she, her pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance. And we are the only national organization that organizes and convenes queer, trans, AA, and HPI organizations. So yeah, honored to be here, thank you.
Wow, and we're so honored to have you both. I'll start off with Alina Yin. You mentioned how you work at the intersection of civic storytelling and political education with your work. Based on what you experienced, why are these conversations around voting rights, why do they often struggle to emotionally resonate with younger API audiences until our rights are already under threat?
Yeah, great question. And I think the answer is not only nuance, but it's contextual depending on where you live. So I'll try and give a generalized answer, but I know that it's a one size fits all is not the answer. And I think meeting people where they're at, one, and then two, it's less about telling when it comes to the youth, it's less telling them about why it's important and using the right slang or whatever Gen Z is speaking. And it's more about connecting to the real life issues than creating like a genuine space for them to be a part of the conversation, a part of the process, and a part of the solutions. And in terms of like rights being under attack, I think it's much more systemic, that the youth themselves, did not create this situation, but they were born into the culture of 3-minute reels and like 1-minute hot takes. Mm-hmm. And so the constant input, and there's no time and space to not only reflect, but like flex their imagination muscles and think about and project into the future. So, how do we solve that? Curriculum and civic education in like K through 12, yes. But I think a larger, slower process is like, which because K through 12 in our public education system has their own legislative battles with curriculum right now. And, just teaching AAPI history. And so I think we need to create space and bring them into the fold now. And it's an imperfect, all hands on deck moment. And we're going to have to like figure it out as we go. And so how my organization is doing it is, we're working with college students and high school students, and I often just hand them the reins and like give them parameters, give them the source documents, and I let them figure out what's best for them. And I provide guidance, and I give them a lot of room to experiment and fail, and then encourage them, to reflect what worked, what didn't work. And oftentimes what I found is when I give them the source documents and I help walk them through it, they come back with longer form content. And I was like, whoa, what's this? Because they understand and see for themselves all of the missing context when you push it down to 1 minute hot takes or 3-minute reels. And they themselves create the longer form content, but in their own way.
Wow. Well, thank you for everything that you do, Alina. And I want to encourage all of our internet friends, if there are any topics that you'd like to see Alina do a reel on, she has definitely been at the forefront of political communications and all things civic engagement. And speaking about storytellers, I'd love to turn to you, Kat. So how does cultural spaces and storytelling influence whether people believe civic participation belongs to them?
Thank you for this question. So I just want to state that I come into this work as an artist, as a cultural strategist. And so for us, we believe in power of art and culture to move economics and politics. I'd like to use the quote by Jeff Chang. Some people are in culture some of the time, but some people are in politics some of the time, but everyone is in culture all of the time, right? We are immersed in culture every day, from the moment we wake up, from what clothes we decide to put on, or what music we want to listen to, or what food we want to eat. So culture is where, speaking to what Alina is saying, we want to meet people where they're at. Culture is where they're at, right? And so that's really important. I think another thing that is really important to us to understand is that any system of power is held up by a story. It's held up by a story. And love that you're taking notes. Please. There's a philanthropic leader. His name is Edgar Villanueva, wrote Decolonizing Wealth. And when he said that one of the most powerful stories ever told is the story of white supremacy, right? And it didn't even need facts. It didn't need, like, it's a manufactured racial hierarchy, right? And that has really influenced the systems we live in now. So for us to dismantle systems, we have to dismantle the stories that hold them up, and we have to tell stories that are more beautiful, that are truer, that inspire people's political imagination in its place. So at NCAPIA, for this midterm election, we are getting ready to launch a storytelling project where we're centering trans folks and their parents who are loving and accepting, because we need to see stories of families accepting their trans relatives, children, siblings, right? And using that as a way to inspire people to vote with love. Usually we voting becomes like a very logical thing, and we remove our emotion, like our hearts and into it. So part of it is, how do we create a story that voting is actually an act of love? So that's one thing that we're exploring this year.
Wow, thank you so much, Kat, for everything that you're doing through your organization, and especially with having all those boots on the ground. So I want to turn to Jel, Dr. Cortez. In your opening remarks, you did mention a lot of statistics and how API data can be described through numbers, specifically population growth, visibility, professional success. But I have watched a few of your or mostly all of your talks, and you've argued that numbers alone don't automatically translate into political power. Why is this specific moment around voting rights important for our Filipino community specifically?
Yeah, thank you, Angela. And whoever's typing, we like that you are taking notes and trying to capture the essence of the wisdom that Kat was dropping. But if you can mute, I actually don't know because you were all muted, so I don't know where the kind of phantom typing came from. But Angela, to your point, and I want to also tap back on Kat's sentiments just around the importance in this the spreading of our stories, especially LGBTQ plus, for our trans community members, telling these positive, loving stories in the midst of rampant book banning and the uncoupling of decades-long work to teach our stories in inclusive curriculum. And that goes for ethnic studies, that goes for Asian American studies. And this backsliding that we're seeing is meant for another webinar and another day. But to your question, Angela, of the responsibility that comes with being 21 million deep nationally, and that is about the number of the national AA and HPI community in our population. Filipinas X's and O's being 4.4 million across the country. The largest diaspora outside of the Philippines is the Filipino American diaspora in the United States. And often when you go to different social, cultural, other celebratory events in our communities, you hear that number thrown. We are so large. We are vast. We are a diverse community. We're multi-talented. Filipinos have been here since, the 1500s. So I think the natural extension of that conversation is, okay, now what responsibility do we have to build cross-racially? What responsibility do we have to show up for these fights? Because a community can be large, but without being connected, without being engaged, we will always struggle to translate our presence into influence. And that influence looks like, of course, shaping policies that are helpful and equitable to the communities we care about. But it's also this understanding that they're not coming for us today, but they will come for us eventually. And I think it's Angela Davis who wrote that in one of her seminal works, that it might not be today, but there will be a time where they will come for us. And I hear those words so resonantly right now as I think about just our sheer size and how we can really be a player in shaping and being a contributor to the defense of our democracy. There was also a New York Times article that I want to reference that came out in October of 2024. And this political commentator essentially looked at the growing population of Filipinos in Las Vegas and wrote that the growth was so considerable and so exponential in that region that if Filipinos voted together, they could swing entire election outcomes in the state of Nevada. We don't vote together. So that's to Kat's very important work about storytelling and narrative. And I do think there are certain powers that be right now that understand that we cannot be behind the 8 ball when it comes to storytelling and who's controlling that narrative right now. I think there are other forces out there that understood it a lot sooner than other groups. And now we're seeing the result of that and the power that they are irrationally wielding in swaying hearts and moving minds. But I believe in the work of AAPI and all of our roles and responsibilities in storytelling right now.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Cortez, for those reflections. I'm hearing from the common DNA thread through Alina, through Kat, through Dr. Cortez that it's not a one-size-fits-all. We have to continue uplifting our brothers and sisters across the board. And when it comes to these spaces, really prioritizing the folks that are doing the work so that we can continue that momentum going into these upcoming historical elections. So now let's move on to the understanding of the historical legal context about this Callais versus Louisiana decision, especially when it comes to the Voting Rights Act. I'd love to invite each of our panelists to introduce themselves before we begin. I'd love to start with Ijaz Baluk, followed by Joshua.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Ijaz Baluch, he, him pronouns, and I'm a senior staff attorney at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, here in Washington, D.C., where we bring litigation, we bring court cases, as well as do policy advocacy to advance the civil rights of Asian Americans and immigrant communities.
Mabuhay, everyone. My name is Joshua Ang Price, and I am the Executive Director of NAFA, which is the National Federation of Filipino American Associations. We are the largest national nonprofit group that specifically focuses on our Filipino American communities. We have 14 regions across the United States, as well as 27 additional state chapters. And I'm so happy to be on this call. So thank you so much, L.E.A.D Filipino, and thank you, Jel, for having me. Two of NAFA's main core focus areas is civic engagement, which includes voting rights, as well as national advocacy. And then I was also a former election commissioner in the state of Arkansas, which is just north of Louisiana, for 2 terms back in 2019 through 2021. So I have a lot of opinions about this court case, and I'm really happy to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Ijaz. I'd love to start off with Ijaz. So for our internet friends that are just joining us here tonight, Mabuhay, who may not be familiar with voting rights litigation, can you please explain to us what the Voting Rights Act is and what specifically Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was designed to protect?
Sure. So I think Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan summed it up best when she said in a decision a few years ago that the Voting Rights Act represents the best of America, and it also represents the worst of America. And it represents the best of America because it promotes multiracial democracy, and it protects voting rights such as prohibiting voting intimidation, language discrimination, and the dilution of minority voting power, which are all things that have protected AAPI communities for over 60 years. And it also represents the best of America because it's been widely hailed as the crown jewel of the civil rights movement of the 60s. Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders like John Lewis marched to Selma, Alabama, demanding that Congress pass this law, the Voting Rights Act. But it also represents the worst of America because in order to get this law passed, people had to fight, protest, bleed, and even die on the Selma, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge during those marches. But it was based on that pressure that the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, eventually called on Congress to pass the VRA, making his famous "We Shall Overcome" speech. And it was successful. It passed in 1965. So specifically, Section 2 of the VRA is designed to prohibit practices and policies that deny or dilute the right to vote on the basis of race. And this includes voter intimidation and other barriers to voting. So for example, it protects Asian Americans from being profiled, intimidated, or denied their right to vote at polls solely based on racial identity or accent or limited English proficiency. And at issue in the Callais decision that we are talking about this evening was Section 2's provisions about racial discrimination in elections and something called racial gerrymandering. Now, you might be wondering, what is racial gerrymandering? So in general, gerrymandering is when politicians draw maps of their districts so that certain voters are included in their district and other voters are excluded out of their district. And so in effect, what gerrymandering does is allows politicians to choose their voters rather than the other way around, which is what it's supposed to be, which is voters choosing politicians. And so racial gerrymandering is when politicians draw maps that result in minority voters and voters of color being unable to vote for the representatives that they want, or preventing them from casting a ballot at all. And what Section 2 is supposed to do is empower minority voters to bring lawsuits to stop these kinds of maps from getting drawn.
Thank you so much, Ijaz. Can you walk us through what exactly happened in the Callais versus Louisiana decision and why that decision has raised concern across the board among voting rights advocates nationally?
Sure. So basically, the Callais decision, which came out at the end of April, so a very recent decision, In that decision, the Supreme Court unfortunately gutted Section 2 as it pertains to redistricting. So the court said that while the court said on the one hand, Section 2 only applies when a state is affirmatively discriminating based on race while redistricting, as opposed to what it used to be, which is that even when drawing a map that has a racial discriminatory outcome, that's enough. And the court said that's not true anymore. It's not enough to simply have a racially discriminatory outcome. There needs to be intent to racially discriminate. And not only that, the court also said, and this is the part that is really, really harmful, the court also said that it's completely okay to discriminate as long as the discrimination is based on politics or partisan advantage. So when you combine these two conclusions together, that having a discriminatory effect is not enough, you need intent, and it's okay to discriminate based on partisan advantage, when you combine those two things together, what that means is that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act only applies when you can, what they call, disentangle politics from race. And in order to bring a lawsuit, you need to show that there is an alternative way of drawing a district that still discriminates based on politics, but doesn't discriminate based on race. And that basically is almost impossible to do. Because in reality, voting who you are, as who your racial identity is, and what your politics are often very closely tied together. They're often very related to each other. Not always, but a lot of the time they are. And so what this decision allows states to do and politicians to do is to discriminate based on race when they're drawing their districts and gerrymandering, but then they can now turn around and say, well, we're just doing this based on politics. This has nothing to do with race. And unless you can show that that those two things you can separate those things out, which is almost impossible to do, you're going to lose in court now. And that's the big problem that this decision has created. And in fact, we're already starting to see this happen. This case just got decided at the end of April, and already Louisiana, Florida, Tennessee, and Alabama have already either redrawn their districts or they're currently in session, currently redrawing their districts to exclude minority voters and basically spread them out so that they have less political power.
Wow. Wow, thank you for sounding that alarm. I get a lot of angry emojis in the chat. I'm sure we're all riled up here about the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. I'd love to turn to Josh. And you did mention how you previously served as the elections commissioner. How do these legal and structural changes actually affect communities that are on the ground politically?
Well, that's a really good question, and Ejaz, I'm so glad you brought that up, because this is why we need nonpartisan, independent redistricting committees in every state. It's just so important. You know, I have to say, when I heard this decision was coming out of Louisiana, I sadly was not surprised, and then I also thought about, you know, the Filipino community, one of the oldest in the country in St. Malo, and it just immediately made me think about how this is going to affect our communities all across the country. But again, yes, I lived in Arkansas for a while. I grew up there and lived there for a long part of my life, and also did serve as an election commissioner on our largest county, Callais County, which is the capital is Little Rock, that's the county seat. And it's interesting because at that time I was also working for the federal government, and I worked in Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, so all through the South, and kind of saw the same challenges to our voting rights and then the gerrymandering coming to light. And really, to me, it's a form of Jim Crow 2.0. And I mean, that's what we would call it. It's just another form of control to repress minority communities. And actually, while I was an election commissioner, we went through redistricting, and Pulaski County, which again is our largest county, was divided into 3 congressional districts. And it was along racial lines. Like if you took the new map and laid it over a demographic map of the city, it literally was like, here's the Black community, we're going to merge them with a rural white community. Here's the Hispanic, Latinx community, we're going to merge them with a different rural white community just to dilute their voting power. So as far as like the real world implications of this, so unfortunately, states in the South, like I said, having that history of Jim Crow, a lot of times they are used as, I like to say, testing grounds or laboratories for these types of laws before they go national. One thing that was implemented in Arkansas previously was requiring additional documentation to vote. So that's really worrisome. And I know some of that was coming up in the Save America Act as well. But, when you think about how it affects the voter, something may look good on paper as far as, oh, this is going to make voting safer or whatnot. But when it comes to the real world implications, if a voter has to show additional documentation like a birth certificate or an adoption papers or marriage license or divorce decree, anything that's showing a change in their name, that can be very troublesome and difficult to get, especially with bureaucratic red tape, and especially for Filipino and other immigrant communities. Because think about it, what if you were born in the Philippines? What if you got married in the Philippines? So now you're having to get this documentation from a foreign country just to be able to prove that your name is the same name on the polls so that you can vote. We also saw the United States Postal Service funding get cut, and that's going to affect the ability to send in mail-in ballots as well. I know in a lot of rural communities in the South, it's already difficult to get mail, and so I know a lot of those areas, they're only picking up mail on certain days now. So your vote can definitely be affected by that as well. And I want to just leave this question with a personal story, just to show the real world implication of all this. In 2019, I went to vote in a school board election, and of course, I brought my mom with me. And it was very slow. There were not a lot of people voting at that time. So there were two separate lines to check in with the poll workers. So I said, Mom, you go to one line, I'll go to the other. So we'll be done at the same time, because normally I would go with her to vote to just help her with language assistance or to explain, issues or millage, things like that. So I go up to the poll worker, and by law in Arkansas at that time, you had to show a photo ID. So I pull out my photo ID, and he says, "Oh no, Commissioner Price, I know who you are. I don't need to see your ID." And I said, "Well, wait a minute. That the law says you have to show an ID." He's like, "Well, but I know who you are. It's okay. It's okay." I said, "You know what the law is. You know what the rule is. Just look at my ID." So he glances at it real quick. I step aside. I turn over. My mom is still stuck in line, and she's waving at me. She's like, "Toto, come here." That's my nickname, Toto. So I go over there, and she says, "Yeah, I showed her my driver's license. I'm in the poll book, and the poll worker says I have to show my passport to prove I'm a real American." And I'm like, "No, that's not true." So I confronted the poll worker. I said, she's shown one form of ID. That's all that's necessary. So she apologized profusely, but she said, "Sorry, Commissioner Price, I didn't realize this was your mother." And I said, "Well, what does it matter if it's my mother or not? So is this something you're doing all the time?" And I've actually repeated this story to Filipino American communities, not just in Arkansas, but all across the South. And the exact same thing has happened to them. The exact same thing. And in fact, for a lot of them, they did not know the rules. They did not have a son who happened to be an election commissioner with them. And they would go home, try to find their passport, and a lot of times not make it back to the polls in time and not be able to vote. So seeing this Louisiana versus Callais decision, to me, it's just a continuation of attacks that we've already seen on our voting rights. And it's really troublesome because, again, I feel like it is a form of Jim Crow 2.0. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I think it's very alarming for our communities.
Oh yeah, extremely alarming, especially when it comes to really close, contentious congressional races where it's only counted by like a handful of votes, right? So I'm so sorry how you had to experience that. But thank you for sharing. I'd love to turn to Ijaz. You mentioned terms like racial gerrymandering, voter dilution, and voter cracking are often used in conversations that we hear online and also in person. What do these terms actually look like in practice?
Yeah, so I think a really good example of this sort of stuff is actually pretty recent, 2024. So just a couple years ago, there was a lawsuit in Nassau County, New York. It was brought by the New York Civil Liberties Union, Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and other civil rights groups. And basically what was happening in Nassau County was after the 2020 census, Nassau County wanted to redraw their maps. But the census showed that the Asian American population in Nassau County grew a lot. It like exploded. It was up, increased over 60%, almost 60%. And especially in one particular neighborhood, the greater New Hyde Park area of the county. But Nassau County also has a really deep history with racism. And unsurprisingly, there was this large amount of Asian Americans who started living in the county, and they all, mainly lived in one particular area, the greater New Hyde Park area. I mean, other areas too, but that's really where they were concentrated. And how they redrew the map was that even though they all lived in this one area, they divided them up into several different districts. And that way, the candidate, the people in that community who are concentrated in one particular geographic area could never have enough votes to vote for the person they wanted in that local election. And so in 2024, they sued. And they said, hey, this is illegal, what you're trying to do to us. You can't break, we live in one cohesive community. You can't break us up into all these different districts. And then last year in January 2025, Nassau County, they settled the case and they said, fine, we'll redraw the map. And now they redrew the map, and they didn't break them up anymore. They put them they created a district that included most of them in the same district, and now they have a much better opportunity to vote for the candidate they want. And I think it's important to note that they were able to bring this case because New York State passed its own Voting Rights Act called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York, and they passed its pretty recent law in 2022. And they used this law to successfully challenge these maps and get them to redraw the map. And I think that that's a really important piece when we start thinking about, how do we move forward, is having these state laws that do the same thing that the Supreme Court can't mess with because they already mess with the federal law.
And on that note, many Filipino and API communities don't necessarily see themselves reflected in these voting rights cases or redistricting litigation generally. What would you say to these folks that are saying sentiments like that, who may not see that connection?
So I would say two things. The first thing is that API voters are the fastest growing group of voters in America. And, we talked about Nevada earlier. And what's true about Nevada or Nassau County is happening all over the country. So for example, from 2020 to 2024, API voters grew 15%, or 2 million voters. That's a really large percentage when you compare that to the growth rate of voters overall, which was only 3%. We composed of 15%. And during the 2020 presidential election, Asian Americans were larger than the margin of victory in 10 different states: Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Hawaii, Pennsylvania, Texas, Florida, and Michigan. They essentially decided the election in those states. And in 2024, it grew to 13 states. There were 3 more states that, if you were to combine all the Asian American voters, they essentially decided the election in those states too. And there were 2 states in the last election, Illinois and Arizona, where Asian Americans comprised of 96% and 91% of the margins of victory, respectively. And so, we are a very, very important group of voters. And so as a result, our communities can often be the difference when there's a narrow margin of victory in an election, especially because, some of the states I mentioned, those were really important swing states, states like Pennsylvania and Arizona, Georgia. And so, for example, if our communities are divided up like they tried to do in Nassau County, and like they might be trying to do already in some of these states in the South, then that hurts our power when we're already a very powerful group of voters. And the second thing I would say is that, the VRA, in addition to the protections that it used to have about, racial gerrymandering, the other protections are really important, especially for our communities, like language access. So for example, one of the things that the Voting Rights Act protects is that it says if there is a particular district where there are a large number of people who have very limited English proficiency, that the polling location needs to print the ballot in their language so that they can read the ballot, understand who's on the ballot, and know who to vote for. And this is, especially for Filipino American voters. For example, in Alaska, there are two districts in Alaska that print their ballots in English and Tagalog, so that Filipino American voters in those places can still have the right to vote and can read the ballot. And so these are really, really important protections for voters of color and for us, for our communities as well. And we need to continue to push for those protections and be vigilant about having those protections, because they really help us a lot.
Yeah, big fans of language access. We fought so hard to keep it. So let's make sure we have them long. So to Josh, what do communities often misunderstand about how representation and political power are shaped long before elections?
No, that's a great question. And I'm going to put on my former federal government hat here because, a lot of our funding was determined by the data. So, we have to have demographic data on the community to know how to properly fund those communities. So I think it goes back to the census, number one. I know Filipino Americans were not great at filling out the census, but it's very important for us to be counted so that the government is able to know how big our community is so they can allocate the funds properly. And then second, of course, voting. Voting is so important. That's clearly how we make our voices heard. And then I would say representation also very much matters. I always say we just can't start with voting and just end there. Like, you have to attend your city council meetings. You have to have a seat at the table. You have to be visible. You have to eventually run for office. And an analogy I like to use, because we're Filipino and we love parties, right? We love to eat. We love parties. I would say to the Filipino community, let's say I'm planning a party for the Filipino community and I'm inviting 100 Filipinos, or I think there's going to be 100 Filipinos, but only 50 RSVP. Okay, so that's the census, only 50 RSVP. So I'm going to only order food for 50 people because that's how many people RSVP'd. Now, unfortunately, I did not put a tita on the planning committee. There's no representation because that tita would have told you, hey, I know it says 50, but everyone's going to bring a friend and a cousin, and there's going to be actually probably like 150. So now there's no one representing the community on the planning committee. So I only bought enough food for 50 people. And now we don't have enough rice. And we don't have enough lumpia. And like, the party is a disaster, right? So that's the analogy I like to use with the Filipino community to show them why that census matters, why that voting matters, and why having a seat at the table to provide that input for our community really, really matters.
Thank you so much, Josh. And you know what they say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, to go along with that
Absolutely.
anecdote. And for our last question, Ijaz, so what protections or legal pathways now feel uncertain because of Callais, particularly for communities like ours, communities of color, trying to challenge these maps and systems that dilute our political power?
So, unfortunately, after the Callais decision, it's virtually impossible now to bring a Section 2 lawsuit based on racial gerrymandering. It's really hard to do that now. And I think the logic of the decision is also threatening other civil rights laws and protections. And when I was just explaining the decision earlier, something I said was that one of the things the decision says is that it's not enough for a decision to have a discriminatory effect. It needs to have a discriminatory intent. And that is a really dangerous concept, because there's a lot of decisions that the government makes, that politicians make, where they're not saying they're being racist. They're not coming out and saying, I hate Asian Americans, I hate Filipinos, or I hate Black Americans, and so I'm going to do this. But the decision they're making is clearly going to hurt people of color or marginalized communities. And we currently have other laws, civil rights laws, that say, look, even if you don't have the intention, if your decision is going to hurt a particular group, it's still illegal. But if this idea that it's not enough to have a discriminatory effect, you have to have the intent, and intent is something that's really hard to prove in the law. If someone's not just saying it, it's really hard to show that that's what they were trying to do. So if this idea that effects are not enough, you need to prove intent, if that that idea threatens a lot of other civil rights protections, and that is something that is really scary. And so we need to do everything we can to prevent this concept from infecting other civil rights laws and protections.
Yes, thank you, Ijaz. Thank you, Josh. Can we give a round of applause? Virtual hearts, uh, virtual applause. So thank you all for breaking down the legal and structural stakes surrounding voting rights and representation. Broke it down like boxes on recycling day. And now that we understand the legal decisions, we have a better understanding of how community power is also built through organizing, coalition building, civic engagement, storytelling, online and in person. So super excited about our next panel, how we're really going to see what comes next, right? Like how can we still continue to stay engaged, knowing all the legal ramifications. So I'd love to invite Kat to start us off. Your organization works nationally at the intersection of organizing, narrative strategy, and culture. What role does storytelling play in whether communities see themselves as political actors or simply rather than reacting to systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think storytelling impacts voters or whether they choose to vote a lot. I think there's a narrative that's out there that our votes don't matter, right? That's one harmful narrative that already exists. Like it's not going to make a difference if I vote in this state. It's not going to make a difference on the larger platform. We all already believe this story, which we know is not true, right? And so I think creating a different story around how powerful our votes are. And I think, like, for example, Ijaz, the how you said that, I mean, API voters are wedge voters, right? We have impacted the direction of outcomes in a very big way. And I think that stories like that do not make it to our communities as much as they need to. So I think that's really important. I think that so we need more stories like that. I also think that the stories that we tell shape how our communities understand ourselves, our challenges, and our power, right? And so for us, like for like queer, trans, A, and HPI communities whose stories are rarely seen in public life and cultural visibility, it in itself is a form of civic empowerment, right? Like civic engagement, civic empowerment is not just voting. To Josh's point, it's voting is one tool, but there's so many other tools, and storytelling is also a political tool.
Oh yeah, definitely. Especially we have so much rich history, and if you know history, you know yourself, right? And along that thread, many of our communities already gather culturally and socially. Like we see our raves, right, at Seafood Cities. We see our world tour of Bruno Mars, Olivia Rodrigo. We see our parades up and down the country. So what does it look like to translate that energy, right, into sustained civic participation and organizing?
Ooh, I mean, such good places. Again, these are events that we meet our communities at, right? These are where they're at. If we can, and I know Lead Filipino does this already, like do voter registrations at these events, other educational opportunities. Yeah, that's not what they're there for, right? They're like, I'm here for the Olympia, I'm here for this singer or whatever. But there are ways to galvanize them in these spaces. I also think like having different, maybe like folks that are more well-known, celebrities, influencers in our communities at these events who can speak to it. We see it all the time at award shows where they take the opportunity to use that platform. We really want to encourage and give the tools to folks who have a platform on how to speak to these issues in these spaces, so that it is accessible to folks. So, I think that the important thing is that, like, we understand that authentic civic engagement for ANHPI communities, they have to be rooted in the full complexity of intersectional cultural context, right? We are very culturally driven people. And so if there are ways that we can infuse stories and culture around civic engagement in spaces that are meant to be celebratory, like it actually latches onto them more. Like folks don't want to come to a town hall that's an emergency, that's like scary. Actually bringing this to them where they're in joy, when they're in community, actually, I think resonates more with our communities.
Yeah, I hear you. So just making sure that we capture that energy going into the midterms. I'd love to turn into Alina Yin. You mentioned your highly successful civic engagement podcast called Only in San Jose. I'm a fan. I may be biased. How do media narratives and digital culture shape whether communities actually understand these attacks on representation as democracy issues rather than it just happening in the ether?
Yeah, I think, when I was sharing about this event, I was saying that, these laws that we're discussing today, the laws that bind our lived reality, connecting policy and law to our lived experience, like Joshua's wonderful story about lining up to vote. That's like a very powerful story. And, no matter what branch of government the laws flow from, in order to materialize in real life, they have to reach all the way down to the local level. And so that is the poll workers, that's the election commission workers. And it's in those places that it manifests, and each place is different. Where like I'm just learning about, the traditions and the culture around voting in Texas versus in California. And so each place is truly different. And there is, again, no one size fits all. And the stories that we tell are extremely powerful, because if it wasn't, they wouldn't go to such lengths to ban books. And they wouldn't be writing laws where you can't teach specific histories. And so creating spaces where we get to tell our own stories, because I think part of the culture in America is that there are storytellers that are considered legitimate. There's mainstream media, there's journalism, and anything else is considered gossip. Where, culturally, the AAPI culture, we come from like villages and communities where there are cultural bearers and they tell the stories, they're trusted. And so rebuilding that and creating space for the one auntie that knows all the tea, and the other uncles and tios and manongs and manengs, and like all of the people who carry the history. And where we connect is in those cultural spaces, which is why we go to the parties to go register voters, because I think the white culture of America is the town halls, is these very formal settings. And so that's where they operate. They're not doing it at like the dinner table, at the parties, at the quinceañeras or anything like that. And so it just shows the difference of culture. And I think getting really local is definitely a way to do that. And we're meeting them where they are, which is right now in social media. But eventually, we come offline. And I just had a campaign where I shared, it was about data centers, and I shared online, and, we got like 40,000 views and like 100,000 views on another one. And from there, we got like 260 letters. And then from the letters, we got 24 people to show up in real life for public comment. And all of that made a difference. And so I'm like prefacing to people like, this is the process. It's really dry. It's not always accessible. But because I made it accessible and I told them like this is a conversation. It's not the be and all. It's going to be the first of many meetings. So setting their expectations, because most people think, you mobilize, you show up, and then it's just going to be one vote and it's done. And then they have the lived experience of like, oh, it doesn't count. Why did I show up? And so there's like an education piece. And then there's the practicing in real life piece and doing it in community, because democracy is a team sport. Like if you show up by yourself without your coalition, it's a very disheartening and heartbreaking space. You have to show up with your family and with your community. And so I am like coming from a very local space and in my corner of the world. And I would say that I spent my political attention is probably like 70% local and then 30% global. And I don't know, like, if we take a moment, like, how often are we absorbing news from other places and people don't even know what their school board is or what district their school board's in? And if they're not paying attention to that local space, guarantee there are people who have been paying attention for decades who are shaping the local arena that shapes your lived reality. And so tapping into the local space is new. It's old, but it's new to a lot of people because, like, as a Cambodian American, most of us only arrived in like the early mid 80s. And if you think about the country that, my ancestors, my family came from, they didn't have a right to see the city budget or the provincial budget. They didn't have a right to like petition their government for redress or grievances. They didn't have that kind of government. And how many AAPI cultures did come from a legacy of that type of government? And so this is a first for, I think, a lot of AAPI cultures to be in, the democracy that we have now that is in flux. But, to know that you have a right to inspect the receipts and to like call your elected officials out without fear of retribution, even though that's changing right now. But that does exist and they have that right. And if I explain that to my parents, they're like, well, that's weird. Like, we can do that. And I was like, yes, you can do that.
Yeah, I feel the energy and tapping into that excitement and that energy that's happening online. We do see that younger people tend to get their news, their political information through short form content, like you mentioned, through reels, through sound bites, and even influencers, right? They trust these people that seem more authentic than talking heads and politicians. So this is a very much like a fragmented media ecosystem. And for many of us, our civic, cultural, and advocacy organizations, how do we adapt to this changing environment? And do you think that we should even adapt?
Yes, we always have to adapt to our changing conditions because that's how we survive. And I think part of it is what's interesting about the younger generation being more influenced by content creators and not mainstream media is like they're actually going back to that village format and they're looking for the cultural bearers within their peer group. And without us and like, our communities being there to guide them, there's somebody else guiding them. And so connecting to where they are, and also, it's not their fault that they have such a short attention span, because when social media came online, none of us were the wiser that would be what it is today, and that we would have the attention atrophy that both adults and younger generations are suffering from. And so they're born into a context and conditions that none of us predicted. And so it's not their fault they are that way. But as adults, we are responsible to a certain extent of guiding them and creating the spaces for them. And like I shared earlier, when I do create the space for them, they are ready to engage and they're interested. And I have high school students that hosted their own podcast and had a conversation for over an hour, and it's just like time flew for them. And part of that too is the social media impacts on the way they think and their attention span is still very new, and they have much older DNA that's still very rooted in the olden times of connecting through storytelling. So it's not impossible to reverse that. And so I think doing the short form, but don't copy trends, because it's not about copying trends. It's about just speaking authentically to them. And they can tell, like, they're very, very good at sussing through that. And they're also very good at catching the paid influencer in this midterm election as well. And so they're much smarter than I think we give them credit for when it comes to like detecting bullshit, because they've had to like do that to survive. And so being authentic and genuine with them, they will give you points for trying. That's what I'm told. Like, they're like, Alina, you don't have to like copy the Gen Z chat. Just like be real, and like we can tell when you're being real and that you're trying.
Yes, authenticity is key. And I'd love to turn to Jel. So you often talk about the difference between visibility and organized power. If our population numbers alone aren't enough, what kinds of civic infrastructure do our Filipino communities actually need to build moving forward?
Yeah, and I also just want to acknowledge the questions and the comments that are coming through on the chat. Yes, Carmen, let's definitely connect. Have a lot of love being dropped for all of the speakers. So if any of you want to shift over to the comments, or Angela can read them out momentarily. I think that for Lead Filipino, because we operate across California, Nevada, and Texas, I call it ignorance leaving my body constantly. To be from and of the San Francisco Bay Area, of San Jose, but to also, now split my time between San Jose and San Antonio, two very different contexts with respect to not just the governance and the political ideologies and who's in power of both states. You also have very different electorates. But then when I think about the Filipino exo communities that we are in service to, in the Bay Area, we are very much engaging and attract 1.5 second generation Phil-Am college educated and have those privileges and are very hyper aware of around class consciousness, around social justice issues, around power and privilege, and being true and very valid critics of a capitalistic organization of our economy, imperial frameworks, and having those discussions. When we go to San Antonio, when we go to Military Town, USA, and we are at the Simbanga Bay events, and we're trying to register aunties and uncles to vote in the context of Texas, where many of our peer organizations on the ground are under constant threat of being sued by the Attorney General or being sued actively, it changes the air in the room. So when we approach our aunties about voting, do you have a vote plan? Do you know that there's an upcoming election? There's almost this change in the mood. And they're like, oh, we're good. The second that they see a flyer with a voter guide or Iboto Filipino, they're quick to ask about the social aspects of what we offer. So we are actively, when we talk about meeting folks where they are, the base building looks like the relationship development. It also means if Lead Filipino's membership meeting ends at 6 p.m., I'm still there at 9 p.m. because I am sitting alongside our youth, our aunties, and even with the college folks, because we do have the honor of working with the Filipino Student Association at UT San Antonio through SIFA, the statewide association of Filipino collegiate organizations across Texas, from Houston to Austin to Dallas, and even uttering in conversations around a politicization of maybe our existence as Phil-Ams or AAPIs, whether or not it's about inclusive curriculum or an anti-Asian bill that Governor Greg Abbott passed brazenly that allows landlords to openly discriminate against individuals who are from a country of origin listed in the bill text as from Taiwan, Iran, or China, mainland China. When we bring up those conversations, there is a clear and palpable discomfort. And it's an extremely different context than raising those conversations at UC Berkeley. So I think, again, it is truly ignorance leaving our bodies. And when I consider the infrastructure that we need, I think it needs to be multiple, many, and in parallel. Because we also are working and serving now and have the honor of working with green card holders, Filipinos in our community who are undocumented, who do see themselves as civic owners, because for the longest time, our parents, their parents, we were taught survival, but we were not taught civic ownership. And I think our survival now is connected to seeing ourselves in civic ownership. But I also think it's not just connected to each of us as Phil-Ams and AAPIs, but it's also going to be done cross-racially and multi-ethnically. And that does look like, I love the way Alina put it, eradicating ourselves, extricating ourselves from the decor of white structures and white conventional thought of the only way to look productive is holed up in a committee meeting or sitting around a conference table buttoned up. I do think that we can also be productive and we can be transformational and we can be impactful sitting around the mahjong table, sitting into the late hours on a Sunday evening at a community center? Why are you still at your membership meeting when it ended 4 hours ago? I am still here because that's what our community needs. They need conversation, they need stories, and they need presence. They don't need we're starting on time, ending on time, see ya, hope you come to the voting seminar. And you don't call it a voting seminar. You instead lead with the values. You lead with the values of, and I have so many different stories about some of my very conservative family members chiding me and ribbing me because I did work and continue to do work through the prism of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I will say that. But when I represent justice, equity, and diversity and inclusion to them and they sneer at it because of what they've heard on Fox News, when I represent that Lead Filipino is, in fact, a vestige of and in the spirit of Jedi, they're like, wait, we rock with that. We rock with what Lead Filipino is trying to do. Well, exactly. So it takes the conversation, it takes the storytelling. And I really think that is the currency that is scarce, and we need to protect it, and we need to cherish it, and we need to spread that, because stories are what we're going to have, and we need to own them in light of our realities and our experiences being banned left and right, because they know that we are the true power.
Can I add to that just really quickly? We need to be telling our stories is so incredibly important, because that's why they're consolidating all of the that's why like they're gobbling up all the news sites and different companies, because it's so powerful. And I have family members that also listen to Fox News, and now it's going to be in charge by who, and then like Washington Post is owned by who, and so we're losing those spaces. And so part of our strategy is definitely how do we create our own spaces and then get them to our family members in our community.
Yeah, we heard a lot of mic drop moments right now and across our panelists. And as we begin wrapping up tonight's discussion, I'd love to each ask you 2 final reflection questions. What would you say to someone or our internet friends listening online right now? How can they get involved? And what engagement strategies are your organizations currently using to bring our communities into this moment? I'd love to start off with Ijaz.
So I would say there are 2 important things. So the first one is that it's still, no matter, despite everything we said tonight, it's still really important to vote. Like many of my fellow panelists said, it doesn't end there. There's more that's not sufficient, but it's still necessary. And you might be wondering, well, what's the point? You know, if they're attacking my right to vote, if they're trying to take it away, if the Supreme Court is doing all these different things, what's the point? And it still matters a lot. And that's because sometimes when politicians are redrawing these districts, they're redrawing these maps, they get carried away because they think nothing's going to happen. And what they do is they take a safe district and they try to spread it out to all these different other districts that they want to gain control of. But what that does is it brings the margin of victory down. And if all the people who originally were there all turn out to vote, but the people the politicians want to vote don't turn out, then it actually backfires, and then they end up losing the election. And so it's still really, really important to turn out to vote. One thing that we're doing here at AAJC is that in conjunction with API Vote, we have a hotline. We run a hotline where voters can get answers to questions about voting, and they can receive assistance in English and 9 different Asian languages, including Tagalog. And I'll just plug that phone number right here, right now, just in case it might be helpful. It's 1-888-API-VOTE. That's 1-888-API-VOTE. And you can get help to vote in the next election, both primary and general election. So those are 2 things that I wanted to let you all know
about. Josh, would you like to go next?
Sure, I'm going to echo Ijaz, sorry. The voting is so important. And for everyone that says, you know, I don't think my vote is counting, I don't think it matters, I will tell you, when I was an election commissioner, we had a state representative election that was won by 27 votes. We had another one that was won by 24 votes. We had a special election to fill a vacant seat that tied literally tied. And it was only 363 to 363 votes. And this was a district of 30,000 because nobody came up to vote for the special election. And he had to wait like a week for a mail-in ballot from a person who was on vacation in Sweden to come in. And that ended up being the tiebreaker. So all those young folks that say, oh, I don't think my vote counts, it absolutely counts. Like we all have 24, 25, 30 friends that we can get our barcada together and go vote and like swing a whole election. So I would say get out there and vote. And then as far as what NAFA is doing, well, I told you we are 14 regions, so we're working on voter registration and GeoTV like we normally do. But I'm actually based in North Florida now, in Jacksonville. So my specific area of focus is Georgia and Florida, because I know these are two very key states during the midterms and also have very large Filipino American population. And Alina, I love your idea of meeting folks where they are. And now I'm like, maybe like a karaoke voter registration drive or something. Like, I feel like that's how we can get the young folks out. But yeah, that's what NAFA's working.
Thank you for sharing, Josh. Kat, would you like to go next?
Sure. Well, y'all already know I'm gonna say tell your story. But for real, like get involved, like learn, like reading is still cool, guys. But really like get out there, be in community with folks, really be like in a learning stance in this moment, because there's so many different things happening. And I know there's so much information coming at us. So identify who your trusted sources are, who your trusted messengers are. See how you can get involved. I know L.E.A.D Filipino is looking for people to register voters. There's so many ways to get involved. Again, civic engagement looks so many different ways. Even telling your story around voting and maybe some challenges you had around it and how you've overcome that helps a lot. I think just there's something out there for someone, right? And identify what issues, like be self-reflective of what issues you care about. And I would also say have a difficult conversation with people on the other side. I know I have a lot of conservative family members too, and I created a short film called Get Your Tita, really on how we can get creative on I was like, get your cousin online, but it was like, how can we get creative in having these discussions? Like cultural strategy doesn't happen just in pop culture. It happens at the dinner table. It like a lot of in API communities, like the aunties listen to the aunties, right? So again, like I gather people together, go through a ballot together. I did that with my family in 2020. It was a hit. I converted a couple. I was really proud of that. Thanks. And then as far as what NCAPIA is doing, we are providing virtual trainings on a monthly basis. I am doing the next training, which is next Wednesday, on cultural strategy. The following one is on narrative strategy. And then the second one is on, the third one is how to build narrative strategy projects. So we have trainings on a monthly basis that are virtual and free. We also have this Vote with Love campaign that's coming out. Really want to center, LGBTQ rights are under attack and trans folks are under attack at an unprecedented level. So we really need folks to kind of see what the intersections are as well. So that's something that we're hoping to provide at NCAPIA, is just a way to bring people together, a way to learn together. And hopefully that shifts how we vote together.
Yeah, I love how you're making voting fun. So I'd love to turn it to Alina.
Yeah, just echoing what everybody is sharing. If I think back to Project 2025 and I literally printed out the book and of reading through it, their strategy is about dismantling from the top down so that it is state controlled. And then within those states, the county is an arm of the state. And so what that really means with their strategy is that our local governments are going to become not only the last lines of defense, but the front lines of defense for our democracy. And they don't have a tight of a grip on local governments as we all think they do. They really don't. And so there's a lot of room for us to get involved locally. And whether that's volunteering to be a poll worker, door knocking for a campaign, or helping people to register to vote. There's so many pathways. As an artist, as a poet, as a storyteller, as like a researcher, you're really good at writing letters to like your local elected officials. There's so many pathways. And I would also say that for us, the data center fight is something that I am seeing uniting people across party lines and multi-generationally. And the interesting thing about the data center fight is that it taps all of the branches of local government. So it needs land. That land is either within city boundaries or county boundaries. So you're looking at your city or county planning commission. And then they need water, which is your water district, which is a special district. Then they need power, which is like your local utility, which is a state agency. And there's local aspects too. And then to get the power generators, you need your air permit, which is with the air district. So it's tapping all of these agencies that most people are just learning about for the first time. And they're learning really quickly. There's a lot of coalitions. And so even if there isn't a data center in your town, like, oh my God, bless you, but there's something maybe around or you can help and just tap in and you can learn really quick because they're moving really fast. And also the data center and like generative AI is the thing that the oligarchs are really clamoring to control. And it is going to become their tool to further erode our democracy and transform it beyond our recognition. And so this tool is just massive right now, but the organizing on the front lines and local communities across the nation is phenomenal. Like for the local organizing I did just in San Jose, Santa Clara County, I would say that more than 50% that participated for the first time in any kind of public comment and any kind of writing a letter to their local government. And that was a survey that I took and I like polled them. And we got 1,700 people in like 2 weeks to sign up. And now it's a coalition of 1,700 that I was not expecting. And there's like high school students, there's retired folks of all cultural backgrounds. And it's a very interesting space to watch right now because the organizing is really incredible. It's really fast. And they are sharing. So like I was just on a call where I'm talking to people from Memphis and from Georgia and we're exchanging strategies. So now we're like talking across state lines and we're learning about the differences between California and Georgia. And then we're building compassion. I was like, oh, okay, so I can't just blame like you get what you voted for. I was like, no, voting is so different in another state. Like a lot of Californians don't realize the privilege we have with our voting protections versus somebody in Texas or somebody in Louisiana. And like, it's so easy to just read the mainstream media and cast our judgments on the red states and just say like, you chose that. When really you have no idea what they chose because you have no idea what their choices were. So I'll end it with that.
Wow.
Boards and commissions, always boards and commissions.
Yes, local government is ground zero for systemic change. And we do need to dispel that myth that our voices don't have power. We need to use our voices to share our stories. I'd love to turn it to Jel for her closing reflection questions.
Did you want me to speak to how to get folks involved, or did I already hit that earlier? I'm just kidding. But I do think as we bring this conversation to a close, again, the first of many, on the point of local electeds and municipalities being that last line of defense, I solidly believe that there will be incoming opportunities for groups like ours, civic organizations, cultural institutions, storytellers, cultural bearers, legal experts to push to, and this was just an idea I had today, having conversations with a few folks. I call it our dreaming and scheming sessions, to get local governments to categorize civic engagement and civic literacy as public safety, or thinking of that as a holistic health tool, to have that earmarked in health and human services budgets and allocations, because we know this is powerful. We know that when people see their agency in their locality, it changes how they show up, and inherently the system has to respond. And so in our quest right now, across the balance of this year, to contact 15,000 Filipino and AAPI voters across the cities that we're operating in: San Jose, San Antonio, Las Vegas, San Diego. We have phone banking sessions taking place all across this month. Up through May 26th is the Texas primary runoff. June 2nd, as we know, in California. June 9th is Nevada. To knock on doors, to get in front of our folks, because it's one thing to talk about the conservative aunties and uncles. It's one thing to have the youth and the students who are desiring of conversation around classism and racism and how do we combat misinformation and disinformation. But when you're staring at them in their doorway and they're like, who are you and how did you get my information? The organizers that we are training and sending across these cities, safety first, but the organizers that we are training and sending across these cities to get on the phones, to have these conversations, we are learning so much, and we will continue to share those insights. You couldn't believe some of the things in the context of immigration policy that we hear on the other line when we're calling our aunties in Vegas. So there is a lot of work to be done. I don't want this call to end without us saying, and without the Filipinos on the line. I'm not saying we're responsible for our entire communities, but there is a lot of deep, nourishing work to be done in dialogue with our hearts and our heads intact, and to do that respectfully as we consider how we have these conversations in a values forward way with our families and with our relatives, and that we lead with love, to Kat's point. So we are on this crusade, y'all, to engage 15,000 folks. We need to knock on 1,000 doors across Bexar County over the next few months. And we're running our Voter Hub program in San Jose, Silicon Valley, with Latina Coalition and the Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits. We have a partnership that we're minting with one API Nevada out of Las Vegas to run targeted canvassing with Filipino casino workers and those in the hospitality industry, to have kwentuhan, to have storytelling sessions, not to tell them what to think, but get them to think in these moments and to connect their stories to our stories. And I think that's part of cracking the mindset of, I am out here in America individually on my way, and everyone else can get lost on my own journey to that pinnacle. But it's like my wins and my wellness is connected to yours. So we are still writing and learning what that transformation looks like. We're also leading our health educator session later this summer. Our 10-week Filipino Studies and Civic Engagement course will also take flight later this summer. Our Queer Filipinx LAPI Summit, if you are in the San Jose, Silicon Valley area, we will be at Santa Clara University, as well as preparing for Filipino American History Month, which of course precedes our November 3rd general election nationwide. So this year is one to get in. I want everyone who's listening, all two of you out there, thank you to the two of you. But I want everyone who's listening and who might watch this at a later point to know that your civic power is your own journey. And it does start with voting. It shouldn't end with voting, but it starts with voting. And if that's what you have capacity for, then we honor that. Not everyone needs to go run for office or join every board and commission or go to law school or go study public policy and advocacy or work in this space. I think you being present and being visible and challenging yourself and having those conversations and voting in accordance with your values of love and democracy and Jedi and Filipino social justice and representation, I think that has to be the starting point for everyone.
Wow. The chat is popping off. All the love
There's
to
11.
our panelists. Yay! Well, thank you again to all of our panelists for sharing your insight, those knowledge drops and expertise with us tonight. We'd love to also thank all of our internet friends for dropping their questions in the chat. I'd love to start off with Alyssa. She says 35% of Philam voters supported Trump in 2024, one of the highest shares in AAPI. Voter autonomy is crucial, but how do we productively address concerns of oppression and discrimination to our relatives? And she follows up by saying, ooh, amazing, that answered my question, the power of stories. But if anyone wanted to chime in and answer Alyssa's question.
I think finding a topic where you don't start with politics and like Democrat or Republican or whatever, but an issue, like whether it's healthcare or the speed bumps in your neighborhood, like something that is meaningful to them. And then when you talk about the process of how we would change that and educate them, like most people, like their eyes light up and they're like, oh, I didn't even know that that was in my power, because they've been told all this time just to vote, or like your vote doesn't count, and like not all the other avenues of powers that they actually have access to. And I've seen this with the youth. When I walk them through things, there's a different fire underneath them when they learn about the actual levers that they can pull on that no one has ever showed them.
I'm going to chime in with Lena on that one. I think like at NAPA, with us being nonpartisan, and as we tackle some of the policy issues that have come up, we always take it back to Filipino core cultural values. Like, what would Kapwa do? Like, what would Bayanihan do? And I think that's a great way to approach, like you said, we approach the issue, but when you approach it from a Filipino lens, something that's older than political parties in America, right? That's where we've seen that's been effective.
I would also say, ask them what matters to them. Like, we can't just be on there like ready to preach, right? We actually need to pull out their stories too. Like, what is informing their current values, or what's informing how they want to vote? What are the things that, like, issues like is one thing, but like what do they care about most? And I think when you could align that and be able to connect it with the political issues that are at hand, that goes a long way. And also they feel like they're being heard, right? The other thing is, our conservative family members, like, we already know there's this narrative of like, oh, the progressive left is this elitist, educated, intellectual. Like, we actually have to combat that too, right? That narrative, right? And so really bringing it on a human level, on a relative, like at the end of the day, like, I love my conservative family members. Like, I really do love them. And I want to know, and I want them to know that I care about them, not just, just because we're on different political lines doesn't mean I love you any less. I'm frustrated with you for real. But we could still connect on that love, right? Or respect for one another. So I think, like, yeah, ask them what they care about. Let them feel heard and seen too.
I'll also just add one last thing. Is like sometimes maybe it's not you, maybe it's your cousin that needs to talk to your mom, because like I can't talk directly to my parents, and like my best friend can't directly talk to her mom, but I can talk to her mom. And I did, and we like engaged, and she is very of the mind like all government is corrupt. There's no point, like why even bother voting? And after a few conversations, and she listened to one of my podcasts, I convinced her to actually apply for the Santa Clara County Civil Grand Jury. And so now she still has to be accepted and pass her interviews, but she believed enough. And then my friend Julie was like, I tried for decades, and you had like 2 conversations with her. And I was like, because it's different. Like there's different, because parents will always look at you like you're their child. And so sometimes, like, if you're in proximity to a tia or like tita, and like, bring your cousin in or bring your other friend in, and that cross conversation, it's very powerful.
Yeah. Thank you all for the knowledge gems that you dropped And thank you to all the love that we're feeling in the chat. I just want to point out that Carmen, she's an advocate, and she said she'd love to connect with all of our organizations to talk about her Together We Vote program. It's a civic literacy program. So yes, Carmen, we will reach out and we'll schedule time to chat. We'll put her in connection with all of our panelists so that way we could all be in COPWA together. And again, I'd love to say thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their insights and expertise with us tonight. I do want to invite Dr. Cortez to share some closing remarks.
Ultimately, just can everyone join me in thanking Angela for doing a masterful job with moderating this evening and pummeling through all of the funky tech challenges that we had, including the phantom typing. We eventually did get Instagram to go live across all of our platforms, but overall, just want to thank our partners, NCAPIA, NAPA National, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, the Dreaming Collaborative, and to Angela for making tonight possible. Something Ijaz said earlier that I want to leave us with, just the importance of, and we're overlooking, I think, in California, where we have super majorities and we are the progressive, the blue beacon of the country. I don't want us to overlook the importance of how some of our groups might need to come to work alongside and to show up in conversations and in movements and advocacy around state level voter rights acts, especially in the other two states that we operate in, Nevada and Texas. They do not have VRAs. Some states will continue to bend the knee to whatever is coming out of DC. So I think that is, as we consider this new political era, what next? That's still unfolding, everyone. And I know that many of our national counterparts in AAPI, progressive organizing and legal spaces, will continue to have legal briefings. And we'll share that information across our platforms. We will keep you all updated. But I think the state level VRAs, that is the only hope for some of our partners. So how can we show up, and how can we, Alina shows us how to do this daily. How do we convert that attention, the following that we have online, to show up in these local spaces? And I think that's really going to be the next test in how we can show up. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Have a blessed evening, and we will be in touch real soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.